my ringer off.
Okay, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Apparently we got our tech line down a little bit better. Oh, talk about challenges. Alrighty. Who is God? Who is like God? We're in Isaiah chapter 40 today, about 700 to 695 BC-ish, Jerusalem. Now, the first 39 chapters of Isaiah have a message mostly of impending judgment and destruction because Israel is going to be paying for its sins by being exiled to its enemy Babylon for 70 years. But in chapter 40, the prophet Isaiah switched to a new message, that one day the exile would be done and give way to freedom. I think he means both earthly freedom and spiritual freedom. Try turning this on, because I don't think I had this on last week. There we go. That a little bit better?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We start out over the 6 verses. The first section is the first 3 verses, questions without answers. And these verses become actually more meaningful when read with some background, because in Isaiah's days, many believed that military conquest was a reflection of the superiority of the victor's God over the gods of the side who was defeated in battle. Because remember, Jerusalem's going to fall to Babylon. So this was weighing heavy on their minds. Now, to the Israelites, their defeat to the Babylonians might well be viewed as pitting the relative power of their God, our God, Yahweh, against the Babylonian God, is it Marduk? Scott?
Sounds right.
Marduk? Okay. Close enough.
Close, yes.
All right. But further, there was a common school of religious thought that there was a system or a chain of command with some sort of a council of divine beings, with the lower deities advising the chief god, which kind of begged the question of where Yahweh might fit in the scheme of things if that were the chain of command system. And then finally, the Babylonian Empire was fascinated with the night sky and believed it revealed destinies. Now, the Babylonians, if you'll recall from prior lessons and sermons, Babylonians put really high stock in the astrologers being able to use the night skies to predict the fate of individuals and empires. And getting into the first 3 verses in 12 through 14, Isaiah refutes the Babylonian theology and its creation story, and he emphasizes the power of the uniqueness of Israel's Yahweh. He asks a series of rhetorical questions to which the answer was clear. Only Yahweh, Israel's God, enjoys dominion over the entire universe. Nobody can access his will or knowledge. Well, what am I doing here, aside from apparently scribbling? There we go. All right. Verse 12. Who hath measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and meted out heaven with a span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance? Isaiah here is recalling the order of Genesis 1, from the waters to the sky to the earth, which is very distinct from the creation myths of the ancient Near East. They had other explanations. But he's recalling that Genesis 1 order to establish that all of creation is under God's dominion. And here, Isaiah further emphasizes Yahweh's sole dominion by dismantling a familiar Babylon prayer that the Babylonians recited at their New Year festival, and it was directed to Marduk and their other gods. In that prayer, in part, the Babylonians would ask, who measures the water of the sea? And they would answer themselves Marduk. But Isaiah uses similar words here to that Babylonian prayer to ask questions designed to take a theological punch to Babylon's Marduk. But instead of equating Yahweh with Marduk, the implied answer to each of Isaiah's 3 questions here is no one. The rough translation, the Babylonian Marduk is nothing. Neither the Babylonians revered Marduk, nor any assemblies of gods compared to Yahweh. With the word needed in, I think the second clause here, and here needed means more than just measuring the heavens' dimensions. It's more in the nature of directing, determining, and ordering. In other words, exercising dominion. So with the word needed, Isaiah also drives home his point that humanity is not subject, contrary to the Babylonian belief, to the sky's destiny, as the sky is subject to God's dominion. Contrary to Babylonian theology, Yahweh knows and directs the future. It's not up to the stars. And Isaiah also introduces a second dimension of creation theology here, that God is the architect of the universe using measuring instruments. So you see measuring heaven with the span of his hand, measuring the earth in a scale, and weighing the mountains in scales. Now, while the world's expanse is unbelievably great to us humans, it's minute to God. God's role as architect is also revealed in a few other places in the Bible, such as Job's divine speeches, which describe how God created all things, and in Proverbs 8. And particularly in Proverbs 8, wisdom was personified by describing her experience of the creation as she watched God construct the cosmos. And her wisdom's place at the beginning of creation emphasizes the wisdom and purpose that motivated God's creative act. He wasn't doing things just willy-nilly. There was a grand master plan. Now, the second set of questions that Isaiah poses. Who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord, or being his counselor hath taught him? Isaiah here is transitioning to two questions that concern God's will, and he further attacks Babylonian astrology. While the supposed source of fates follows God's direction, nobody directs God's spirit. God's unmatched. He's free from outside manipulation. Nobody, no council of deities or anybody else, directs, determines, or measures his spirit. And again, he doesn't have any divine counsel because he doesn't need it. It's just God and only God. He's the sole God of the cosmos. And if you look at Psalm 82, verse 7, that points out that the gods of the nations, quote unquote, are destined to die and therefore are nothing. Then we go to the third set of questions in verse 14. With whom took he counsel, and who instructed him, and taught him in the path of judgment, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? Here Isaiah is drilling down and emphasizing his point from the prior verse. He asks who God seeks counsel from, and the obvious answer is no one. Not only does no one advise God, which we saw in verse 13, God seeks no one's advice. Not even like the Babylonian vaulted Marduk, who was maybe a superior god but advised of a council of deities. Yahweh doesn't need that. No one knows the cosmos like its creator. You know, if there were a council of deities, they would have neither knowledge nor understanding to advise God. And nobody directs or informs God's hand or his mind. So then we go in the next three verses, statements without responses. In these verses, Isaiah drives his theological principle onward and turns to the political landscape. And he starts and ends in verses 15 and 17 with some general statements, but in verse 16, he narrows in on a particular location, Lebanon. in between those two verses in a model that we can apply to any nation, not just Lebanon. Now, Lebanon, if you'll recall, served as the northern border to the Promised Land, and it was a source of valuable cedar timber that was used in construction. And biblically, it's often used to symbolize beauty, strength, or judgment. Okay, first general statement in 15. Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. So, going back and looking at historical context, after years of exile in Babylon, the Israelites probably felt that they had a pretty good feel or appreciation for the weight of nations. Assyria, Babylon, and the newcomer Persia were crushing tyrants. However, Isaiah is reminding the Israelites that things like the water that fit in God's hand and the dust upon the scale that he talked about in verse 12, those things that are seemingly immense to us are minute to God. So in comparison to those things, all the nations, whether you're talking anything from the small city-states clear up to the domineering empires, those things must be like mere specks of dust or drops of water to God. And the political coalitions on earth, likewise, were like dust to God. So no nation, near or far, bears any weight before God. He really doesn't accord them any importance. And that becomes even more significant in light of Israel's historical experience. Because remember, Israel had already suffered Egyptian enslavement, had been required during certain periods to submit to the Canaanites. They were deported by Assyria, and of course, more recently exiled to Babylon. But when you look at it, Babylon gave way to Persia. Persia gave way to Greece. Greece gave way to Rome. So, the conquerors became the conquered at some point. They weren't all that in a bag of chips forever. They were just fleeting. Even the great empires were fleeting in historical context. So while the weight of nations felt heavy to the Israelites, they're frivolous in God's eyes, and they don't hold any power over him. Actually, the reverse is true. The nations yield to God eventually. And here in verse 16, as I said, Isaiah drilled down specifically on Lebanon. And Lebanon is not sufficient to burn, nor the beasts thereof sufficient for a burnt offering. So again, Lebanon was Israel's northern neighbor. It didn't have a kingdom war in it, didn't have a kingdom that was warring against Israel. Lebanon was actually passed between kingdoms and empires. It was even briefly under Israel's control during the reign of King Solomon. Lebanon was full of wildlife, copper, iron, wine, and notably valuable timber. But even the surplus of Lebanon's abundant timber forests and its very abundant wildlife could not supply enough wood for sacrificial fires, and neither could its abundance of wildlife be sufficient to feed burnt offerings. So Isaiah is arguing that even if the wealthy and abundant Lebanon was insufficient for offerings and in other religious things, how much less so were the other regions, because they weren't as rich in resources as Lebanon was. And then if you look at Psalm 60, that says that every animal and all wildlife are God's. No animal, even if you included the unclean ones that were inappropriate for sacrifice, no animal sacrifice, even if you depleted Lebanon and stripped it of its abundant wildlife, no animal is going to be sufficient. In Psalm 50 continues that instead we're supposed to offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving. praising God as the cosmos' architect for everything that he's done. And then going on to the third set of statements. All nations before him are as nothing, and they are counted to him less than nothing in vanity. So here Isaiah returns to his dismissal of the nations, and he regards them not only as mere droplets of water and specks of dust, as he did in verse 15, Isaiah now states that they're actually not only nothing, but they're less than nothing. And he described the nations that had descended from ordered creation to chaos, from nothing to less than nothing. And here vanity also means chaotic formlessness, because before God spoke during creation, the universe was chaotic and formless. In comparison to God, the architect of the cosmos, which again was very ordered, very deliberate, very measured, the nations appear chaotic and formless. So, what do we get out of this? Nothing and nobody can be compared to God. Not Marduk or anybody else or any council of deities. In the face of challenge, we need to remember that God holds the entire world in his hand. And that's what Isaiah was telling the Israelites. We should never try to manipulate God, but we should rather be comforted that what God has planned will come to pass. Unfortunately, God is on our side, whether we earn that or not. And God's the source of wisdom. We should seek his guidance in everything we do. And when we're burdened by politics, we should rest assured that God is greater than the nations. And in fact, God's greater by far than anything that the world can offer. And finally, no obstacle can ever stand in God's way, because he counts the nations as nothing. They think they're great, but they're not. At least not in comparison. That was kind of a hard lesson.
Yeah, that's tricky.
Yeah, it is tricky, so I'm sure I missed some things. If I have anything to add?
You did good.
God's word's not mine. So, all right, well, thank you very much. There's coffee in the